Hi, everyone. I am Jane Wells from Three Generations, and I'm so excited to be here today with my dear friend Dawn Bjoraker, who is a member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe. But most importantly, I think today I have to share that she is one of the world's greatest lovers of golden retrievers.
It's true.
So welcome to the live stream, Dawn. It's
Thank you.
so great to see you. I wish I could be with you and we didn't have to do this virtually, but it's really thrilling to have you here. And there's so much to talk about. There's so much to talk about every day these days. But I've been thinking generally, we have a little bit of the Constitution on a scroll at the bottom. But I think, we've been thinking a lot since President Trump went to Mount Rushmore about stolen lands. Then we had the Supreme Court case, McGirt versus Oklahoma last week. Then we found out that one of the football teams is no longer going to use its disrespectful name. So there's really been a lot going on with the dominant culture's interaction with the native culture and the First Peoples here. So with that, throwing that out to you, shall we begin? Generally.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. So where should we start? With the Constitution of the United States? I mean, I'm not going to ask you to give us a history lesson of every appalling thing that has happened since contact, but...
Right. Well, first and foremost, you'll notice the ticker down there on the bottom.
Yeah.
That's known as the Supremacy Clause, Article 6, Clause 2 of the United States Constitution. And then you'll also see the words underneath. Part of that says treaty shall be the supreme land. And then a bunch of legalese talk like all judges shall be bound thereby, whatever. And that simply doesn't seem to be the case. This is like every treaty has been violated. And I'm kind of curious on how amendments have such support, and this isn't a discussion about them, but you hear people talk about their constitutional rights and they don't ever want their constitutional rights taken away. And, to be fair and honest, the most commonly known ones that conversation takes place around is the First Amendment and the Second Amendment. I mean, I get that, but I don't hear that same group of people talking about the Supremacy Clause and how treaty shall be the supreme law of the land, because that is specifically in the United States Constitution.
Right. And I think that is like one of the original definition of how the rights of Native Americans have just been systematically not only discarded, but somehow almost obliterated. Like they're not visible to us, which is why I do like the fact that we're seeing this while we're talking, because we do all need a history lesson. And, just thinking about things like violations of the treaties, I was trying to do a little bit of homework here. And, I was looking up the Indian Appropriation Act, and I didn't realize how many Indian Appropriation Acts there really were, because there's numerous ones. But, the Supreme Court decision last week was sort of, on social media, whatever, was sort of widely heralded as this great moment for Native American rights. And, you and I discussed this briefly, but it isn't quite what it seems, is it?
Well, there's a lot of things that can happen with that, right? But first and foremost, I want to applaud the court for recognizing tribal sovereignty and recognizing treaties. I did see an article that came out today about the attorneys general in Oklahoma and how they had came upon an agreement with the 5 tribes there regarding civil and criminal jurisdiction. I don't know if you had a chance to read that, but it seems like it's going in the right direction, right? Like it seems like it's a very good case of how states and tribes can work together and recognize each other's sovereignty and legal jurisdiction, civil jurisdiction, criminal jurisdiction. And so that seems to be working. We'll see what happens, and I'm glad you brought that up, because when I heard about the decision and then I read it, I felt almost like I don't know if it's PTSD or historical trauma, or maybe it's a collective PTSD. I was like, is this real? Is this really happening? Is this decision the real thing? Yeah. So, I mean, hopefully, the government picks up the slack, states pick up the slack. The onus to enforce those treaties should never fall upon one party, right? It's a comprehensive, everybody needs to uphold those treaties. So,
So you were saying, I mean, that this really, the crux of the Supreme Court decision was on the Major Crimes Act, which basically had, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but simply it had defined, I think, originally 7 crimes that would always go to federal jurisdiction if they happened on native lands and involved native people. And then I think it's been expanded to about 13 crimes since then. And that was from the 1850s or something, that particular
late 1800s. Yeah.
So that is the sort of the crux of the law, was recognizing that it wasn't states' rights, right? It's really a battle between states' rights and federal rights and tribal rights, sovereignty here, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it's a battle of I want to back up a little bit. We talk a lot about rights, and that's a good thing. But it's a battle of responsibility. We have a responsibility. I'm going to go back to people who advocate for First Amendment, Second Amendment rights. Those people and us, we have a responsibility to make sure that we're abiding by that Constitution, right? When it comes to the Major Crimes Act, that was a case of Congress, basically saying, not agreeing with the Supreme Court decision. And then they went ahead and enacted legislation, because you can't trump a Supreme Court decision, right? The only time you can do something kind of close to that is through an act of Congress. And that's how the Major Crimes Act came about. Congress didn't quite believe that the tribes could handle prosecuting these crimes on their own. And the Supreme Court basically back then even said, well, yeah, they can. It's their inherent right to do so, right? And so I'm hoping that with this case in Oklahoma, that it can prove to Congress that you don't need to get involved. There's no reason, because once Congress gets involved, all these other things can happen. And that's we don't need that to happen, right?
Yeah. So that's that we'll see how that plays out over the next months and years ahead. But it really does establish the physical boundaries of that territory, right? Geographically, because the land had not been appropriated by Congress, right?
It reaffirms.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. So, and I guess all sorts of potential interesting cases can come up related to that. But just to sort of shift around a bit, I mean, you and I have talked a lot over the years about language. And obviously, the language of the Constitution is some of the most important language in the English, in this country anyway, in the English language generally. But just to digress slightly to the matter of mascots and names of teams. I mean, this is another example of how language relating to Indigenous people here has been misappropriated and misused and abused. Could we talk a little bit about that here?
I think it's just one more example of people not paying attention to the Constitution, right? I mean, if our constitutional responsibilities and rights are trampled on, why would a team like Washington and the owner need to even pay attention to us, right? And I don't for a minute believe that he did it because he had a change of heart. I unfortunately, I think people started to hit him in the pocketbook, and that's what happened, right? it's hard with mascots and stuff, I never understood why people say that they're honoring us. Because I've never seen anybody with red and yellow feathers, weird paint, weird scarves. That to me isn't an honoring. And I can't speak for anybody else. I can only speak for myself, but I don't feel honored. I feel embarrassed, right? If you truly want to honor me, then walk in a humble way, walk in a way that shows me your humility. It shows everybody your humility.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, that, I guess all these mascots have a dehumanizing effect, and they're also part of another way to sort of erase culture too, because
exactly.
I mean, the honoring actually is, as you say, it's actually completely the reverse of honoring, isn't it? Stereotypes are dehumanizing in every way and instance, and I guess we're all, hopefully more of us are becoming aware of that right now. I mean, it is sort of depressing that it is the pocketbook that works in the end, but this is America, and it's always about
yeah, it's always about money, right?
Yeah.
It's hard when you have and my kids are grown, right? My daughter's 27 and my son's 23. He'll be 24 in a couple of months. Mm-hmm. And so when you raise kids and they go to a public school system, which first and foremost, that's another discussion regarding curriculum, right? And we're all fans of football here. We're all sports fans. Mm-hmm. But it's hard to instill into kids a sense of pride and a sense of realness when that's what they're seeing on TV, right? Because that's all they're surrounded by. Mm-hmm. And a lot of kids don't have that impetus at home to provide that guidance. And so it truly does take a village, and it truly does take a community to raise these kids the right way. And to be humble about what they're doing, right?
Mm. I know that you're not really much of a gambler, but do you want to have any bets about what the new name might be? Military and Native Americans somehow. I mean, I don't know. Did you hear that?
Okay, why don't we take it a step further and go with like something to honor, or I ain't gonna say honor, something to recognize not only just natives and football, right? What about everybody? I don't know. I can't speak for anybody else. I don't know if anybody else wants their people based on a stereotype or a caricature. But as far as what kind of moniker Washington's going to pick up, I don't know. Let's just hope it's not a stereotypical version of humans, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm just trying to see if we don't have any comments yet or questions. So I hope that those who are listening live will bombard us or Dawn with some questions. But in the meantime, would you talk a little bit about the work you've been doing with in the urban community in Minneapolis and St. Paul over the last many years?
Yeah. So I kind of go back to a conversation, actually the last conversation I had with my grandma, and she had said, don't ever sell your land, because once you do, you'll have nothing left. And that felt like a responsibility that was too heavy. Mm-hmm. But upon thinking about that further, I thought I took it too literal, right? So what can I do to ensure that the land base that we currently have mm-hmm. is still in our hands? Mm-hmm. Well, if I can help a kid out, or if I can help another person struggling out and maybe get them what they need, or just give a comforting ear and just listen to what they got to say, maybe commiserate them on some experiences we've both had in our lives, mm-hmm. and maybe get them to a point where they're interested and pique their interest in treaties and land bases, then I believe I've done what my grandma wanted me to do, right? So that is something that's always in the back of my mind with any job that I've done. So I've worked in victim advocacy. I was a sexual assault advocate. I did some work with sex trafficking in Indigenous communities. I did street outreach, and that actually was some of I really liked doing that because that was some real work, right? There was that was just real. That's where the work needs to take place, not in some office. And these people are real, and they can tell if you're real. And I appreciate people that I don't need to be something I'm not with. But that was some of the most important work I've done.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's more of a calling than work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Would you talk a little bit about some of the sex trafficking that's happening to Indigenous communities up there?
You know, I think it goes back to I actually think it goes back to people not paying attention to that Constitution, right? They're not paying attention to boundaries. They're not paying attention to reservation boundaries. We discovered that, right? I mean, not that we discovered it, but it keeps getting reaffirmed time and time again. With the pipeline at Standing Rock, they completely ignored those boundaries, right? And they decided that they were going to go ahead and run that pipeline north of Standing Rock versus north of Bismarck because the people of Bismarck were afraid that if that pipeline burst, it would get into their water supply. What do you think it makes us feel like when it's okay, well, we can just put it on top of the reservation? And it's not just that reservation that would have gotten affected if that pipe had burst, right? There's this whole mini Wachoni system that receives water from that river. So between that, between stereotypes that supposedly honor us and dehumanize us and dehumanize our women, there's something else to be said about patriarchy, right? And that's another discussion. It happens, and it happens quite frequently. Yeah, it's a sad situation, but it's one that definitely needs more attention.
Now, I'm just thinking about with the Dakota Access Pipeline. I mean, the right to the water was protected by treaty too, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me that even the word treaty, has become to sort of feels historical, and so it's sort of like, oh, the treaties were back in the 19th century, or the treaties were something written in this script. But of course there are treaties being written and broken all the time. We just may call them like trade pacts, or they may have different words to describe what are essentially treaties.
They're living documents. They're not some curio to be put on a shelf or to be put on a book and to just be pulled out frequently and blow the dust off and look, right? They are living documents.
I mean, it is very exciting to think, interesting to think about the Supremacy Clause really superseding even the First Amendment, right?
I don't want to say superseding.
Coming first?
If you look at the timeline of events, then yes.
Yeah. And how little attention it gets. So one thing that we can say we want to do is to pay a lot more attention to this sort of foundational clause here, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And that's something that, I see a question in somebody had said, how can people in their
I'm not seeing any questions. Okay. Phew, they're coming. Okay, great. Thank you.
How can people in their day-to-day lives help bring awareness or take action with these issues? Books are awesome, right? Books are awesome. Go ahead and anybody has access to the Constitution. You can pull up a new tab right now and Google or whatever your preferred browser is and just Google the Supremacy Clause, right? Article 6, Clause 2. It's really simple. It's too small. And I'm serious about small paragraphs. Start there. Start questioning why you haven't been taught this. Start questioning. That's what you can do. Have real conversations with Indigenous people. One of the things that I would caution with that, though, is when you're having these conversations, is beware of the gatekeepers. If information needs to be filtered out through all these different systems and all these different people, chances are you're not going to get the real story. Mm-hmm. But that's what I would suggest.
Okay. How do you feel about the land maps that are gaining popularity now? I think that may be referring to territorial recognition, or, you know, the idea of whose land we are actually walking upon every day here in the United States.
Yeah, my personal opinion, I like them. I like them because it's good, because even kids will question, they'll say something like, well, that's not what I've seen, that this country or the United States looks completely different. What happened to Illinois, or, what happened to Montana? And it's not a bad thing. This is where those good discussions can come up.
Cool. And I'm just thinking this Supreme Court decision really does force all of us to look at the map of Oklahoma and to see which territory we're discussing here or was under discussion, and where Tulsa is. At least it did for me. Because I think that, we have mental maps as well, and the mental maps can be very influenced and perverted by our political perspectives, I think. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the awesome thing about that is you can be like, okay, well, where were they before they got forced to Oklahoma, right? And then you can go deeper and deeper and deeper. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I was looking at the fact that the tribes that were moved to Oklahoma and the Trail of Tears were called the 5 civilized tribes, which I can't even believe that was a collective noun that was used for, tens of thousands of dislocated people.
Well, if how they treated us, if the ones that treated us like that are considered civilized, I'd rather be uncivilized.
Yeah.
That's why language matters, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's just, and I've been, I was thinking today a lot about, the language of even, talking about the mistake of calling Indigenous Americans Indians, Columbus's mistake there. It just, that's like the first mistake or the first misuse and abuse of language, if you like, there, right? And it just goes on and on from there. But then when we talk about language, we're also talking about the efforts to suppress Indigenous languages in this country too, right?
Yeah, and language is so important, right? Because the way language and sentence structures and all that, and the syntax of language enforces what is considered important. Mm-hmm. Like the syntax of Spanish is different than the syntax of English. Same vice versa, like the syntax of Lakota is different than the syntax of English. Mm-hmm. And that is so important because one of the common mistakes that people make is we're not a monolithic group. Mm-hmm. Here in the state of Minnesota, we have Anishinaabe people and Dakota people. Same state, right? Boundaries, whatever. But there's 2 different nations here. Mm-hmm. Several different tribal communities and several different reservations. But the way we conduct ourselves on our ceremonies is different. Mm-hmm. Right. So what can be considered okay in northern Minnesota isn't something that is done in southern Minnesota, right? Mm-hmm. And there's even language differences. Mm-hmm. So exactly, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're not just as a religious service, for one denomination may be completely different to another one somewhere else. It's something that I mean, there's this sort of idea of grouping everybody together in this one monolithic culture that it isn't at all and never was.
Yeah.
But would you talk a little bit about, I was actually thinking about your mother and about boarding schools and, what happened with language in the boarding schools. Would you just speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, the whole point of boarding schools, is to kill the Indian and save the man. The kids were not allowed to speak their languages. There's horrendous stories on what would happen if they did. Um, and the kids, more often than not, would come out of those boarding schools totally ashamed of who they are. And that's been a struggle. And sometimes that gets passed down. But the only way we can combat that is through learning, right? Man, I could tell you so many stories, but out of respect for my mom, I don't want to do that. But I do know that those schools were really, really bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And language is one of the basic, pillars of any culture.
Yeah.
Along with food as well, I think is another one that tends to get overlooked in these discussions. But you're very careful with your use of language, aren't you? So
sometimes, but it seems like the older I get, that kind of goes out the window. But I try.
Yeah. So just back to mascots and some of these other words that have been misused. How do you think we get the broader culture to stop using them and to understand what is offensive in some of these terms that are used by teams and others? I mean, I'm thinking there are a lot of, other than the Washington team, there are many others, aren't there?
Yeah. I think it's a lot of things start at home. Kids get impressed upon at school. There's a lot of school mascots that need to change.
Yes, school, definitely. Colleges and high schools too.
Colleges and high schools.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what would you like to see in terms of changes? More people reading more, learning more?
Practical things, I'd like to see like school districts and state educational departments really take a hard look at their standards, their curriculum standards. And I know you only have a certain amount of hours with kids, right? And this whole COVID thing kind of really, that kind of threw that thing out the window. But let's be real. Let's not sugarcoat it, because more often than not, what is being taught has been written by the people who are less represented, who aren't appreciated. It seems like we have to learn, we go to school and we learn about them, but they don't know a lot about us, right? And a lot of that can happen through school. And let's be honest, history can be really ugly, and history really is ugly. And there is a way to teach it, right? There is a way to have these conversations with kids, because our kids know about it. Our kids go through it every single day.
Well, I guess that's part of the broader conversation we're having about, about Confederate monuments, right? About, that's one version of it. And I guess the, the whole Mount Rushmore show the other week was.
He was asked to not come, right? Yeah. Like the tribal nations were like, no, but, and people are really, really protective over that, right? Well, that was something before it was Mount Rushmore, and that wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
That's actually treaty territory right there. The Black Hills are treaty territory. We've never given that up. We've never accepted the money that was set aside. But why is it okay to have those monuments on our land, but if we speak up about it and say we don't want them there, we're the bad people, but yet your right to praise at that monument or go and take family pictures is okay? How do you think that makes other people feel? I think we could all use some empathy.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That really was, here's a question. That really was a sort of a total slap in the face. I'd like to know what would be the one thing you want us to walk away from this conversation with today, if it had to be one thing.
Try to understand why. Try to figure out why. Try to figure out one thing. I'm going above and beyond. but maybe ask yourself why you don't know the things you know, or the things that we've been talking about. And it's not to put you in a bad spot or anything like that, but there's a very intentional and specific reason why none of us were taught this stuff in school.
Yeah.
So pick up a book, have conversations with people, have conversations with Indigenous folks, right? Like, and just get to know us like on a human level. And don't come at us and be like, how do I look up my genealogy? That's a question that we get hit with all the time. We're not genealogists. We don't know what to tell you. So just learn. Just learn and have conversations. Like I said, have some coffee, have dinner, just get to know us on a human level, because that's, what we are.
Absolutely. Cool. Well, that's a good question. I was thinking that, it's not really, it isn't your responsibility to teach us history. It's our responsibility to know history, to learn history responsibly, isn't it?
I know it's a scary thing, because if you've gone to school and that's all you know, sometimes the unknown can be a really scary thing. And I recognize that, but things are not going to get better for any of us unless we start dealing with the reality and the truths.
So let's just go back to the Supreme Court again. When you read Neil Gorsuch's summation there, I found it quite moving, actually. He's not my favorite person, do not get me wrong, but it was sort of quite arresting to read his words. Did you feel that too? Obviously about time, whatever, but
yeah, that's in the beginning when we were talking, I'm like, man, is this really happening? Am I really reading this? And that's when I'm like, oh God, that's like PTSD, historical trauma stuff, right? But I thought it was really well written and really well thought out.
And I'm wondering if that is because he is from the west of the country, and that maybe something has filtered through in his experience of living on, in the land in Colorado, or maybe something he was taught in school, or somebody.
Maybe he read the Constitution.
Oh, that too.
Yeah.
We can only hope.
Yeah.
True. Yeah, but he's it was such a surprise, I suppose.
I think a lot of people were surprised by that. We were waiting and waiting, and then that came out, and you're like, okay, waiting for the other shoe to drop or something. At least I was. Yeah.
Well, I suppose if we don't have 4 more years, there won't be moves in Congress to change the law so that there's, whatever. You know what I'm trying to say in a roundabout.
He's trying to say, go vote.
Yes, that's it. Get out there and vote. Yes. Vote with empathy, I think, is what we want as well. And
or come from a place of responsibilities and not rights.
Yeah, absolutely. Empathy, wear a mask, all those things. So as we come to, as we're beginning to wrap up on this, are there any things that we haven't touched on that you would like to talk about? Because this is sort of your time, really. Yeah.
I've always been a curious person, and I've always asked why, because I've always wanted to know why. When I was in elementary school, I actually wanted to be a brain surgeon because I just had this insatiable desire to know how the brain worked. My life didn't go that way. And so this is what led me to dig deeper and deeper and deeper. I had a conversation with this old man once. I asked him why it seems like we suffer so much and why we lead all the health disparities, all the negative health disparities. And he said, because we forgot to use our natural medicines. And I was thinking, I in the back of my head, I would never say this because I had a lot of respect for this elder. Great. We're going to have a discussion about roots and herbs. And that's not what I'm asking. And he said to me, he's like, we've forgotten to use our laughter and our tears. And there's a lot of wisdom in that because cortisol gets released in the tears, right? And it does nasty things in your body if it collects in your body. And then that got me thinking, well, why have we forgotten? Did we intentionally forget, or were we forced to forget?
Wow.
It was more of a forced thing, right? So one of the things that I'd like to say is to everybody, if you got to cry, you got to let that out. You got to step away and cry, and don't take yourself so seriously. Laugh once in a while. It's a good thing.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Okay, so a few more questions. Thank you so much for speaking today. A big question: where can we go from here as advocates for Indigenous people, Native Americans in the U.S.?
I would go to the Indigenous people, and the reason I say this is I gave a presentation out in Seattle many years ago about sex trafficking, and during our Q&A session, one of the social workers asked how they could get Native Americans to come in for services more, and my response was, why don't you go to them? And so I guess, check your biases, reach out to people, but don't do it in a weird way. Do it in a way that's like, let's have coffee and we can just talk about our family, right?
Yeah.
Don't ask us to figure out who your grandma is or who that's not what we do.
There is one more serious question, but just speaking to that, I have to say that one of the most fun times, I've had some really fun times with you, Dawn, but I do remember very fondly.
No, I know what you're going to say.
Karaoke evening.
I know. My palms are starting to sweat just thinking about it.
Oh, no, you thought I was going to talk about when I drove the car on the frozen lake. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Or when I took you stand-up paddleboarding. No, I was thinking about our karaoke night.
Oh yeah, that was fun.
So much fun. So my answer to that is do karaoke. One serious question here: what would you like to see change around our government to give more to Native Americans the respect and representation they deserve?
Well, speaking out, I think currently that's going to be quite difficult. It's going to be difficult to change anything, right? So first and foremost, get out and vote. As far as our government, I don't know, I would press our school districts a little bit more, right? Get involved locally a little bit more, because we have a little bit more pull in our local communities and our local school districts. Whether our kids are enrolled there or not, we're still taxpayers, right? So reach out to them. Anybody could go and search what the curriculum standards are for their state. Start there and see if we're even represented. Yeah. Cool.
And of course, this is something that, I care about a bit, but we are all standing on land that belonged to somebody when the colonizers came. And I think that, we all have a responsibility to find out whose land we're on.
Yeah.
And to honor those who may not have ancestors living today.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to thank you so much, Dawn, for talking to me today, for doing this, for teaching us about Article 6 of the Constitution of these United States, and for your work and I'm sort of glad you're not a brain surgeon, because I don't suppose I would have met you if you had been. But thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who listened. And what else? Vote, listen, have a coffee,
be a good person.
Be a good person. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Okay.
Take care.
You too.